opposites. So the identification of impurity with death must mean that holiness stands for life. So in the Torah we often hear, I've put before you a choice between life and death, choose life. So no wonder that reddish substances, the surrogates of blood, are among the ingredients of the purificatory rites for scale disease and corpse-contaminated persons. These reddish substances, the surrogates of blood, symbolize the victory of the forces of life over death. So the blood of the purification offering symbolically purges the sanctuary by symbolically absorbing its impurities. Another victory of life over death. So the first subject that we encounter in this Torah portion is the red heifer. So it has to be perfectly red. Everything has to be red in it. And so that's because it represents life, it represents blood, and it represents, if we follow through with this ritual, it represents the triumph of life over death, and it represents a cleansing of the sanctuary. So when we have purification offerings in the Torah, who's being purified? Let me just ask you that, Monica. So I've got the answer, but
well, and in Numbers 19, it's the entire community, because they've all been contaminated by this collective murder, which is essentially what it is. I mean, it's not even just death in this instance; it's a murder.
So it's not the offerer of the sacrifice is being purified. It's the sanctuary, it's the people of Israel, it's the community.
No, but then the person who carries out the sacrifice then needs to be purified. I mean, there are a number of different steps that need to be done to minimize the contamination. But we see at the very end of this process that some contamination still remains, and it has to be taken and put somewhere outside the city gates or outside outside of the community. Right.
Like to the shiksa.
Yeah.
Like this.
Where the shiksas can guard it. Yeah, guard the contaminated ashes.
They can live in it, see?
Yeah.
And I can rid myself of these impure thoughts and impure impulses that I have.
Yes.
And I can take them and I can put them onto the shiksa. And then afterwards I can say, you be gone from this holy community. You take my sin. You take my contamination and my impurity. And you leave Pico Robertson now.
It's really convenient how Judaism has that built into it for you. It really, really is. But look, here's the interesting thing. Verse 9, and a ritually pure man shall collect the ashes of the cow, depositing them outside the camp in a pure place. This is really interesting to me because what kind of pure place exists outside the camp? Okay, that's a question I have. What does it mean for there to be a pure place outside the camp?
Yeah.
And then it says, it shall be for the community, for the children of Israel, in safekeeping, as water is kept apart. It is for decontamination. Why is it being kept? Why is there this emphasis on the ashes, the culmination of the purification process? You know, but they're contaminated, but they're being kept for the children of Israel. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's almost as interesting as Barbara's comment in the chat room. Watch and listen as Luke and Monica slay Torah ignorance. So, in the ritual of the ashes of the red heifer, the ashes act as detergent. They act in a very similar way that I do in my life and with my blogging. What I do and the ashes of the red heifer did is that we decontaminate the impure and we contaminate the pure. See, we act as detergent. So with the ashes of the red heifer, you apply it to someone who's ritually impure and they become made pure. But the people who apply it, they move from a state of purity to impurity.
Right.
So when I step into an Orthodox synagogue, I immediately make the whole building impure. But when I step onto a movie-making set, I immediately make these impure people pure. So the startling resemblances between myself and the ashes of the red heifer have long haunted me.
I think you should rename your blog The Red Heifer.
The Red Heifer. Is Monica only into men? Well, she's into text. I'd say.
Right.
Text
Right.
is what Monica's really into,
Yeah.
like books.
Yeah.
She's
That's
a
my thing.
she's a woman of the book.
That's the direction I swing toward the books.
Yeah, definitely. So anyway, that's what that was a roundabout way of answering your question. Why do they get rid of these ashes that do this efficacious thing of making the impure pure? And that's because the ashes act as detergent, and that's why I had to be banned from all these synagogues, because I took the impurity of this community upon myself. I'm like God's suffering servant. Upon me were like the iniquity of Pico Robertson Place, like for their sins I was flayed. And then I had to be sent out of the community, much like Azalel, the goat in the, I had to then be sent out so that they no longer could have to face their iniquities, but they could be cleansed of all their iniquities, and just like send him out of the community.
It's funny. I realize that you're being funny, but there's a tiny bit of interesting truth in that little scenario you're setting up. It's kind of funny. I mean, the one thing I do get from chapter 19 is the importance of division and separation, which of course is fundamental to Judaism in all of its manifestations. But again, reading, I'm always concerned with reading from a contemporary perspective and what it means, and also reading the Bible from a literary perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can't do this now, okay, if we can't enact this kind of ritual now in this era, my question is always, what do we do with the text? What do we do with something like Numbers 19 when it doesn't seem to make sense in this era?
Oh, one thing we can do is study it.
Right, but see, what inevitably happens is we take certain things from Torah and say this is what happened then, and this is what we need to enact now. We do the things that can feasibly be done, but then there are things like this that can't be done, and so we choose not to do them. It's just an interesting kind of selection that's happening. I just wonder, what do we do with it?
I think we just study it. Just like when you don't have a land, you still study the laws about how to run and operate a land.
Right,
because
right,
we did
which
that for
makes
2,000
sense.
years,
Right.
we were able to reestablish the land of Israel as a Jewish state.
But the point of this chapter, presumably, is to teach us what to do, what needs to happen, or to show us what needs to happen in the wake of exposure to death. Okay, so what happens now? I mean, that's my question. How do we fill in the gap?
Well, it says that
Maybe we can answer that.
it says in the book of Hosea that the prayers of our lips will substitute for the sacrifice of bulls. So there wasn't always a temple in the life of the ancient Israelites. So before there was a temple, when there wasn't a temple, they didn't say, we've had it now, we might as well give up. But they kept on with their lives. It's like, okay, we can't do these certain laws, and nor did we say, let's just forget about them and not study them, let's not talk about them, let's not read them aloud, and let's expunge them from our books. No, I mean, it's like, I'm reading a book on marriage right now. I'm not married. I'm 44. I mean, never get married.
You presumably could be, though.
Right.
It's
well,
not
we
completely
could
outside of the realm of.
So we could have the third temple.
That's
and
true.
we could practice these again. So
I've
read a lot of books on marriage. I've read books on relationships. I've even read books on family relations between husband and wife. Now, all these things are forbidden to me until I can get married, but I want to be prepared, so I've read the books, and so I know what to do should I ever get married and be sanctified by God, state, rabbi, community, and Torah. So, like, I'm totally ready to go when that time comes. So, I'm curious, would you like to see a resumption of the sacrificial system?
No, I'm a big fan of text-centered Judaism. Yeah, I don't think there's any reason to go back to ritual-based